In the year 1237, the Mongol Empire, led in the west by Batu Khan, one of Genghis Khan's grandsons, launched what they called the Western March. It was a massive, methodical sweep across the Russ's principalities, and at this point in history, the Mongols weren't just feared. They were performing at their absolute military peak. The numbers are still debated today. Medieval chronicles claim anywhere between 100,000 and 600,000 warriors, an astonishing spread. Modern historians, looking at the real logistical limits of the era, argue for far smaller figures. But even with conservative estimates, we're still talking about a huge army gathering its strength through the brutal winter of 1237 to 1238, preparing to bring the Mongol war machine right back to the doorsteps of the Russian principalities. Their army moved like an engine, fast cavalry up front, siege engineers behind them, and every part clicking together with a level of coordination Europe simply wasn't prepared to face. And the results speak for themselves. The big cities, places expected to hold out for months, maybe even an entire campaigning season, collapsed in days. Ryazan fell in just 5. Vladimir, the strongest city in northeastern Rus, lasted only 4 to 6. When people describe Mongol warfare as unstoppable, this is exactly the kind of timeline they have in mind. So by early 1238, everyone assumed they knew the script. Mongols arrive, city resists, Mongols bring up the siege engines, the walls collapse, the city burns. But right in the middle of that unstoppable march, a tiny fortress town, barely a dot on the map compared to Ryazan or Vladimir, decided it wasn't going to follow the script. Kozel'sk belonged to the Principality of Chernigov and was ruled by Prince Vasily, who was only 12 years old. That detail alone sets the mood. A small hilltop town led by a boy prince, defended by wooden walls and earth ramparts. Yet the Mongols didn't take it in 5 days or 10 or even 20. They were stuck there from late March all the way into May. 7 full weeks, almost 2 months. To put that into perspective, Kozel'sk held out 7 times longer than cities 10 times its size. For an army whose greatest advantage was speed, that kind of delay wasn't just inconvenient, it was almost unthinkable. And that's where the real historical riddle begins. How did a wooden-walled town manage to hold out longer than stone-fortified capitals? Because memories run long on the steppe. 15 years earlier, during the blood-soaked days of the Khalkha campaign, a prince of Kozel'sk had helped kill the Mongol envoys, an unforgivable sin in Mongol eyes. Even though that prince was long dead, the Mongols believed guilt passed through blood and soil, and so the people of Kozel'sk would pay. Lev Gumilev once wrote, "The city of Kozel'sk lay on their way, and the memory of Khalkha led them to its walls. The behavior of the steppe dwellers may seem unjustifiably cruel, but they followed their ideas just as we follow ours." But there was more to it than old memory. Kozel'sk, though provincial in size, no more than 3,000 to 4,000 inhabitants, sat in a critical position. It straddled a vital artery of Russes, a road that threaded between the middle Dnieper and the upper Volga. Whoever held Kozel'sk controlled one of the key crossroads of Eastern Europe, and unlike Western Europe with its thick stone castles or the Middle East with its towering citadels, the towns of Russes were mostly built of earth and timber. Kozel'sk was no exception. Earthen ramparts packed tight with wooden walls rising above them. In peaceful times, these defenses worked just fine. They could stop raiders, discourage bandits, and turn away small, disorganized forces. At the head of the defenders stood a boy, 12-year-old Prince Vasily Titich. He was the grandson of Mstislav Sviatoslavich of Chernigov, one of the princes slain at the Battle of Khalkha in 1223. His precise lineage is still debated. His father is believed to have been Ivan Mstislavich, but what is certain is that young Vasily inherited not only a noble name, but a family history marked by Mongol violence and a fate written in fire and blood. And here's the surprising part. For all its modest size, Kozel'sk was better fortified than the great cities of Kiev or Vladimir. Archaeological and paleogeographic evidence shows a town protected by nature itself. Rivers, swamps, hills, and deep ravines wrapped around the settlement like a natural shield. Earthen ramparts ringed it, and wooden fortress walls stood atop them. It wasn't a grand citadel, but it was a thorn, a stubborn one. Much has been written about the courage of Kozel'sk's people, rightly so. But what truly made the town so hard to take was its geography. The old town sat like an island, surrounded on three sides by the deep, fast-moving waters of the Gisdra River and the soaked swamplands around it. This terrain robbed the Mongols of their favorite tactics, surrounding a city, isolating it, and crushing it with waves of horsemen and siege engines. By late March 1238, the Gisdra had thawed and swollen with the spring melt. The ice that had helped the Mongols storm other towns had vanished. Batu Khan could attack from only one direction, the northwestern side, the single part of the fortress not guarded by the river. Modern Kozel'sk lies on the left bank of the Gisdra River, but in the 13th century, the fortified town sat nestled between the Gisdra and the winding Draguzna River. The Draguzna loops sharply before joining the Gisdra, forming a natural moat around the historical center, an elevated cape almost completely encircled by water. Thanks to archaeological research from the 2010s, we can now trace the layout of that battlefield. The fortress itself, the Detinets, covered just 0.8 hectares. The entire fortified town, perched between the rivers, occupied no more than 6 hectares. On the northeastern edge of the high cape stood the citadel, while the main town stretched across the loop carved by the Draguzna. Strong against raiders, but against the Mongols, they were almost helpless. One of the Mongols' greatest strengths was their ability to absorb the knowledge of the peoples they conquered. Whenever they encountered a new weapon or a better tool, they didn't just admire it. They learned how to build it, duplicate it, and fold it seamlessly into their military system. And nowhere is this more obvious than in their use of siege specialists. During their campaigns, Mongol commanders regularly recruited entire teams of Chinese engineers, sometimes hundreds at a time, sometimes thousands. These were professional craftsmen who knew how to design, assemble, and operate complex siege engines. They followed the Mongol armies from Central Asia to the Middle East and eventually into the forests and frozen rivers of the Russi's lands. Their presence meant that even a fast-moving Mongol force, one that might cover 60 to 100 miles in a single day, could build advanced siege machines almost on demand. Now imagine what kind of advantage that gives you. Most medieval armies needed months to construct a single large stone thrower. The Mongols could build several in just a few days, sometimes even faster, and keep them running through rain, snow, mud, or bitter cold. That wasn't just a tactical edge. It was a technological one, and it changed the nature of warfare across Eurasia. When the Mongols invaded the Russi's principalities in 1238, the local chroniclers didn't always have precise technical words for the machines they were seeing. They used broad terms like paroki or yoroka, which could refer to nearly any heavy siege device. But based on what we know about Mongol warfare in the 1230s, the primary weapon they relied on during fast-moving campaigns was the traction trebuchet, a stone-throwing machine powered entirely by human pull. If you break Mongol siege warfare down to its essentials, their stone throwers fall into two big families, both powerful but each with a very different personality. The first is the traction trebuchet, the workhorse of the medieval world. Picture a long wooden throwing arm mounted on a stout frame, and at the short end, instead of a heavy counterweight, dozens of soldiers grab ropes and yank them downward together. All the power comes from people, pure muscle working through a lever, and the sling on the far end whips the projectile into the air. This design actually originated in China, back in the 4th century BC, and over time traveled westward across steppe routes through Persia, eventually becoming the Mongols' preferred weapon for mobile sieges. The second type is the counterweight trebuchet, the one most people picture from documentaries. A tall wooden structure, a massive box of stone or metal, and gravity doing the heavy work. When the counterweight drops, it hurls a projectile with far more force and far greater range than any traction machine could manage. But this innovation only appeared in the 12th century Mediterranean. And here's the twist. The Mongols didn't introduce this technology into China until after their campaigns in Rus. This distinction matters because people sometimes picture the Mongols bombarding Rus's cities with early gunpowder bombs. It's a dramatic image, fiery explosions lighting up the sky, thunder rolling across the battlefield, but the historical record simply doesn't support that scene for the 1238 campaign. If gunpowder bombs had been used, chroniclers like Novgorod's or Rashid al-Din, writers who loved colorful battlefield detail, would have mentioned the deafening noise. Yet not one of them does, not once. To understand why this machine made sense for the campaign, imagine the battlefield conditions: dense forests, frozen rivers turning into mud, and armies moving at breakneck speed. In that kind of environment, a counterweight trebuchet, a 10 to 20-ton wooden skyscraper, would have been a nightmare. You couldn't haul the counterweights. You couldn't drag the tower. You couldn't even set it up before the Mongol cavalry outran it. But the traction trebuchet, that was built for this world. First, it was highly mobile. Every major component, base frame, axle, throwing arm, rope system, could be taken apart into pieces small enough to load onto camels or horses. Once the Mongols reached a target, their engineers could rebuild the machine on the spot using local timber. Rus's was rich in forest, meaning endless building material, and this matched the Mongol style perfectly. Ride fast. Arrive suddenly. Assemble your siege engines from the nearest trees and get to work. Second, it was strong enough. A traction trebuchet wasn't ideal against thick stone walls, but it didn't need to be. Most Rus defenses were earth and timber, materials that crumble under repeated blunt impact. A few well-coordinated machines operated by trained teams of pullers, including Chinese engineers, were more than enough to batter those walls down. In many cities, it took only 5 or 6 days. If you picture one of these machines, imagine a sturdy wooden frame and a long throwing arm with dozens of men pulling ropes in perfect rhythm. When they yank the ropes downward, the arm whips upward and sends a stone, sometimes the size of a watermelon, hurtling into the enemy's defenses. These machines were simple leverage turned into destructive power. 2 long beams formed the base with strong vertical supports. The arm acted as the main lever. Pulling ropes hung from the short end, and when the crew pulled together, they generated a sudden burst of force. At the long end, a sling added even more speed and range. A small release hook controlled the exact moment the projectile flew free, and physics tied it all together. The more force the crew applied, the faster the stone flew, and the farther it traveled. Against Kozel'sk, where fortifications were mostly wood and packed earth, several trebuchets firing in coordinated volleys could steadily tear the defenses apart. One stone might not break a wall, but repeated synchronized impacts eventually made collapse inevitable. Wood splinters, earth crumbles, and a well-placed hit can tear through a wooden tower, sending debris flying and sometimes even sparking fires. And yet, despite all this technological advantage, Kozel'sk held out not for 5 days, not for 6, but for 7 full weeks. So what went wrong? In the spring of 1238, Batu Khan's army rode up to the gates of Kozel'sk, expecting the usual scene. Another terrified town, another quick surrender. For months, every major city of Rus's had fallen the same way. Smoke on the horizon, envoys offering terms, and then the inevitable destruction that followed when those terms were refused. So Batu tried the routine first. He sent envoys to the gates with a simple offer: open the town and live or refuse and be destroyed. The people inside knew exactly what those words meant. They had watched other towns vanish. They had heard stories of survivors taken away in chains. And they knew, absolutely knew, that no rescue was coming. There were no allied princes rushing to help, no army assembling somewhere out of sight. The princes of Rus's were still feuding with each other, each too divided or distracted to unite. So Kozel'sk stood alone. And yet the people made their decision. They gathered, prayed, and declared, "Our prince is but a child, yet we must die for him. If our names are remembered with honor in this world, we will earn the crown of immortality in the next." Most of the men behind those walls weren't trained soldiers. They were farmers with axes, townsmen with spears, craftsmen who had never marched in formation. But when a community believes that the alternative to fighting is slavery or death, something changes. They fight differently, and that's exactly what the Mongols walked into. An entire population fueled by desperation and faith. But that wasn't the only problem Batu faced. The terrain around Kozel'sk was completely wrong for siege warfare. Batu began by hurling stones with his catapults, but the ground was so uneven and the angles so awkward that most shots went wide. The machines were designed to work on flat open plains, not on rolling wooded hills. So Batu pushed his men forward instead, launching assault after assault. And every time they pulled back, the foot of the wall was left littered with the bodies of his own soldiers. And then spring arrived, and with it came Rasputitsa, the Russian thaw. The soil melted into deep, sticky mud, the kind that doesn't just slow you down, but actively traps you. A man could lose his boot in it, a horse could sink up to its belly. A wooden siege machine could literally be swallowed by it if left in place for too long. Think about what all of this does to a traction trebuchet. These machines depend on people, dozens of them, pulling the ropes in perfect rhythm. But once you add mud into the equation, everything starts to fall apart. The beams grow too heavy to move. The frame begins to wobble and sink. The crew slips as they pull, and the throw loses most of its power. And worst of all, the machine never reaches its full launching speed. Our trebuchet, designed to hurl a 20 or 30 lb stone with bone-shattering impact, ends up tossing it in a slow, useless arc. Annoying maybe, but no longer deadly. And every weak, wasted shot gave the defenders something priceless. Time. Time to patch the walls. Time to reinforce the gates. Time to make a plan. Every able-bodied person, young and old, took part. They manned the walls, carried stones, poured water that froze into slick sheets of ice, making the ramparts almost impossible to scale. Then came the moment that people still talk about when they tell the story of Kozel'sk, the most dramatic act of the entire siege, the suicide sortie. According to the Galician-Volhynian chronicle, the defenders didn't wait for the Mongols to make the next move. Instead, they launched a sudden, furious attack that came so fast and so hard, it completely blindsided the Mongol lines. Imagine a gate bursting open, snow and mud flying, and a wave of desperate townspeople rushing out with the kind of speed only people fighting for their lives can muster. This wasn't a raid meant to test the enemy. This was a strike designed to die in the process, and to cause as much damage as humanly possible before the end. The defenders slammed straight into the siege crews, hacked apart the men pulling the trebuchet ropes, and smashed the engines themselves to pieces. And here's the thing, traction trebuchets are basically sitting ducks during operation. The entire pulling crew stands shoulder to shoulder with both hands on the ropes, totally focused on rhythm, timing, and teamwork. They're not holding weapons. They can't even reach for one without ruining the throw, so if defenders suddenly burst through the fog or the mud, that crew can't defend itself. One well-timed surprise attack doesn't just hurt, it wipes out the entire engine and everyone running it. And that's exactly what the people of Kozel'sk did. In that single attack, they destroyed multiple siege machines and killed the sons of 3 Mongol commanders. For a Mongol army where family honor was everything, this wasn't just a setback. It was a humiliation, a personal insult, a scar on Batu Khan's reputation. And because the entire region was still drowned in spring mud, repairing those siege engines took far longer than usual. Every heavy beam had to be dragged through knee-deep muck. Every frame had to be reset on soft, shifting ground that could sink overnight. What should have been an afternoon of rebuilding turned into days of miserable work. The easy siege Batu expected had turned into weeks of grinding, maddening frustration. At first, Kozel'sk was handled by Batu Khan's main army, the same troops who had stormed Torjok, razed Vladimir, and fought their way across hundreds of miles of winter landscape. But those victories had come at a cost. The men were exhausted, supplies were running low. Even the horses, the heart of Mongol warfare, were worn down from months of constant marching. Kozel'sk shouldn't have been a problem at all, yet suddenly it was. A stubborn wooden town in the middle of nowhere had turned into a brick wall stopping the greatest army in the world. Batu couldn't afford that, so he waited. Reinforcements were marching up from the Ryazan route, but reaching Kozel'sk took time, heavy time. But they had no choice. Batu's initial force simply couldn't overwhelm the defenders quickly anymore. Kozel'sk had become a genuine tactical problem, and there was another angle hinted at in historical sources. Kozel'sk may have been chosen by Batu as a gathering point, a planned hub for regrouping troops, handling supplies, and coordinating the next phase of the invasion. That meant Kozel'sk wasn't just some town that refused to surrender. It was a point the Mongols needed to secure for the entire campaign to stay on schedule. Losing time here didn't just slow them down, it threatened everything that came after. No matter the cost, the city had to fall. But Batu Khan had a bigger problem. His army had run out of crucial supplies, especially anything they needed for fire attacks. No sulfur, no tar, no pitch, no resin. Months of burning Russian towns had emptied their stockpiles, and without fire they couldn't finish the job quickly. So Batu reached back into the darkest corners of Mongol tradition. It started with smoke. Huge fires rose inside the Mongol camp. At first the defenders thought they were simply burning their dead, and they were for a while. Then the smoke changed. The flames grew cleaner, hotter, and that's when the awful truth spread through the defenders like a chill down the spine. They took the Russian prisoners, hundreds of them, men they had planned to use as labor, and slaughtered them. They chopped the bodies and boiled them in great iron cauldrons set up in plain view of the walls. They were after something specific: the fat. Human fat burns hot and slow, just like resin, just like pitch, just like the materials they no longer had. They poured that liquid fat into clay jars collected from nearby villages. They soaked rags in it, tied them to arrows, and launched them in volleys. The rest they hurled over the walls, sticky yellow rivulets of fire that clung to wood, clothing, skin, anything it touched. It wasn't war anymore, it was hell. An Italian friar named Plano Carpini passed through Mongol territory 8 years later in 1246 and heard the story firsthand from survivors. He was a hardened traveler, but even he couldn't shake what he'd been told. If a man like that refused to forget it, you can imagine what it did to the people trapped inside Kozel'sk. Finally, after weeks of mud, fire, and death, the Mongols punched a hole through the wall with their rebuilt siege engines and poured onto the rampart. Night lit up with burning fat. The air was thick with smoke and screams. The defenders, with nothing left but knives and desperation, fought hand to hand in the flickering light. One chronicle says they cut them down with goat knives. And it sounds absurd until you imagine a town out of metal, out of resources, out of everything but sheer will. Goat knives were used for farm work, not warfare. But under those conditions, a knife was a knife. When reinforcements finally arrived, the Mongols suddenly had the manpower they needed to overwhelm Kozel'sk. More importantly, they had enough men to rebuild and operate multiple traction trebuchets at the same time, replacements for the engines destroyed during the defenders' suicidal sortie. For the first time in 7 exhausting weeks, Batu Khan finally had both the firepower and the numbers to force a decisive breakthrough. And that's exactly what came next. Despite the mud, despite the defenders' ferocity, despite shock after shock, the superior destructive force of the traction trebuchets was impossible to resist forever. When one wall finally cracked under the weight of stone after stone, Kozel'sk's last line of defense collapsed with it. Mongol cavalry and infantry surged inside, and the fortress that had resisted nearly 2 months of non-stop pressure was finally taken. The aftermath was horrific. The city and its inhabitants were wiped out without mercy. Prince Vasily was likely killed within moments of the final breach. Centuries later, in the 1800s, workers digging outside Kozel'sk found a pile of 267 skulls, each one showing the unmistakable marks of death by blade. Locals say these were the men from that final stand, the ones who refused to fall back even when the gates gave way, who charged straight into Mongol ranks knowing they would not live to see the next sunrise. The Galician-Volhynian chronicle preserved the judgment of the age. Kozel'sk was the evil city, and the name stuck, not because of strategy or tactics, but because the town fought with a kind of raw, almost reckless human will that infuriated Batu Khan. Historian Vladimir Petrukin put it plainly: Kozel'sk was a small fortress, but it greatly delayed the advance of the Mongols. Taking the city was no easy feat. Yet, leaving it behind was impossible, and this infuriated the invaders. In steppe warfare, leaving an enemy stronghold at your back was unthinkable. Kozel'sk refused to play by Mongol rules, and Batu paid for it in lost time, lost men, and lost honor. The City of Evil label became psychological warfare. a reminder of how one small town disrupted the greatest army on earth. The 7-week delay, the environmental misery, the casualties and the chaos all shaped Mongol strategy, influencing their decision to turn away from Novgorod entirely. Dense forests and swamps helped, but it was Kozel'sk's resistance that tipped the scales. In the end, Kozel'sk showed something simple but profound. Even the Mongol war machine had limits. Mud, weather, and determined defenders could slow the unstoppable. For the Mongols, Kozel'sk was a costly victory. For Russes, it became a symbol of courage, a reminder that even 4,000 people led by a 12-year-old prince could shake an empire. Thanks for sticking around. Can't wait to see you tomorrow for the next adventure in history.